So let's go to Communist China, because they're the greatest existential threat that we face as a nation. We both agreed last time you were before this committee that we need an all-of-government, not just an all-government, but we also need an all-of-society approach on how we face Communist China. This was illustrated in a recent table talk exercise that I did with Senator Coons and others in them, talking about contingency where Beijing tries to do an energy quarantine on Taiwan to force them to capitulate. And obviously unlocking Americans' energy is one of the ways that we can help counter this with LNG and biofuels, some of our strongest tools to be able to help our allies and partners. Cutting red tape, unleashing American energy in the private sector, we're positioned to be an energy supplier here of choice. But we need the infrastructure in place, and that includes having a West Coast LNG terminal. Can you talk a little bit about what you're thinking about when it comes to this type of contingency with regard to an energy quarantine in Taiwan and how the administration would approach that?
Well, first of all, it would be devastating. The U.S., as you know, has agreements in place and assurances it's made on maintaining the status quo in that region, and those will remain viable without trying to be alarmist here. We know what those are, and we hope that never happens. But I think the broader issue that you touch upon, which I don't think is widely understood, again, members of the committee who follows this closely understand it, but more broadly, is the dangerous imbalance that has developed between China and the rest of the world on a number of fronts. The first is on access to rare earth minerals, which they have secured access rights all over the world on virtually every continent. They are predominant and or leading in their access. And it's one of the points of frustration that I have. You go to a country and you see how much money we've given in humanitarian aid, but when it comes to rare earth mineral rights and exploited, rights to natural resources, it's all on the Chinese side. So where's the connection between the aid we give to help countries survive and the fact that the Chinese are going in and somehow from these governments, bribery or otherwise, getting a hold of all these rare earth minerals and leases and contracts all over the place, not just in Africa, in Latin America, all over the place. The second is processing. They process all these rare earth elements. So we are literally, if they decide one day we're going to cut the world off, and they've threatened to do so to some extent with these trade negotiations, you won't be able to build an engine in this country. You won't be able to build a rocket or any of the things that we use in daily life. This is a very dangerous situation that's developed that has to be addressed as well. A lot of it will require domestic changes in our own country and building up our own domestic capabilities, for example, to refine rare earth minerals and to process, but also just to make things. Pharmaceuticals, another dangerous imbalance. We were, all this talk about them getting close to the Europeans, they're dumping on the European market. They're dumping electric cars. They're dumping all kinds of products because they're overproducing. They don't consume. So they dump all these products onto the European marketplace. But you know what the Europeans are very concerned about? The Italians in particular. They used to lead the world in pharmaceuticals, at least in the precursors and the key elements and the basic ingredients. Now the Chinese dominate 80-something% of that industry. They could cut off our medicine. So I think when you talk about energy, I could apply that to a host of critical industries in the 21st century. If we don't address that imbalance, which is what we're hoping to do with some of the trade proposals, but also domestic matters that the administration is taking on, we're going to be in real tough shape here very soon if we're not already.
Thank you very much, Mr. Secretary. I see my time is up, but I look forward to continuing to talk with you about how we can create this all-of-society strategy to be able to fight back against Communist China, because you just laid out a lot of the things that we're at risk at, and we have to have a way to be able to push back on them so that they don't decide to try to take Taiwan by force or try to do an energy quarantine, which could lead to a war which would be devastating for everybody. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay. Senator Cornyn.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. I'm proud of my vote for you to confirm you as Secretary of State. We all know you well, having worked with you for many years. We know of your the qualities that you bring to this job, and I think you're exactly the right person for this job in a very dangerous and turbulent world. When I look at what you and the administration has done just it's May the 20th, January the 20th, President Trump was sworn into office, but just a few of the things that have happened during that time, obviously the critical minerals deal in Ukraine, the Pakistani-Indian conflict, which could have resulted in a nuclear conflict between two nuclear-armed countries. things back closer to where I live, the Mexican water deal that was negotiated with Mexico. I'm frankly amazed at your stamina and what you and the administration have been able to do in a short period of time. And listening to some of the criticism that I've heard this morning, it reminded me of a quote from NFL quarterback Aaron Rodgers talking about dealing with criticism, things he wished he had known when he was younger. And he said, never listen to criticism from somebody that you never would have taken advice from in the first place. But let me ask you specifically about two issues. One has to do with Ukraine and peace negotiations. I applaud you and the administration, and particularly President Trump, for initiating these negotiations between Ukraine and Russia and try to bring a peace, or at least a ceasefire, between these warring countries. This is enormously dangerous, as you know better than most, because it could easily spill over into the rest of Europe, result in NATO becoming involved and the like. But I wonder what you believe Mr. Putin's motivations are. Do you think that he is engaging in these negotiations in good faith, that he intends to give something in order to get something, or not?
Well, I think that's on the question of Putin. I think that's still an open question. I think he approaches it, we have to assume, from a cold, calculated cost-benefit, nation-state evaluation of what's in the best interest of his view of Russia. What I'm pretty certain of is this is not the war he thought he was getting. When he first invaded Ukraine, I think he anticipated that the government would collapse and that he would be greeted as a liberator, and it has not turned out that way. And in fact, Russia today controls less territory than they did after the first 2 months of the war. So they've suffered significant losses. They've suffered the losses of at least, by some estimates, 250,000 men in uniform, and the Ukrainians have suffered less, but nonetheless suffered as well. It is a battlefield today in which the front lines move 10 kilometers at a time in one direction or another. Even if they're advancing at a tremendously high cost. But the challenge Russia faces now is their entire economy is built around the war effort. Their entire economy is built around munitions production and frankly around the fact that you've deployed about 1 million to 1.5 million people to the front lines, and they're making a lot more money fighting a war than they would in the private sector. So I think that that's potentially a challenge here in terms of bringing this war to an end. What we've tried to do is find any way forward to end this conflict. We think it is costly, it is deadly, it is disruptive, and we want to see it end. We want to see it end because of the destruction to Ukraine. We want to see it end because of the strains it's placing on the budgets of countries, neighboring countries, and the fears that it's stirring up in their regard. We want to see the conflict end in a way that's enduring. Meaning not a peace that lasts 3 months and then restarts again, but something that's enduring, that both sides could live with for a long period of time without it restarting again. And that's hard. There's a reason why. This an effort that I wish would have started 2 years ago, but it's starting now. We've done the best we can because we are able to talk to both sides. Obviously, only one side is getting American aid, and only one side is receiving American sanctions. But nonetheless, we think it's important to preserve our ability to talk to both sides. The president is fully aware and has intimated on a number of occasions that he has options available to him in the sanctions field that he could pursue if in fact he determines that Putin is not interested in negotiating. But by the same token, I think the president is very committed to ending the dying, ending the bloodshed, ending the destruction, and he wants to preserve, as long as he possibly can, the opportunity to influence both sides towards peace. The minute you do certain things, your influence over one of the two sides to at least lead to peace really diminishes. And then we're back to where we were in January when he went into the White House, which is with no one had a clear path forward. I mean, there had been no... The first time Russians and Ukrainians have actually met directly and spoken was 3 days ago in Turkey. They had not spoken since the Istanbul process in 2022 had failed. So there are 1,000 prisoners that are going to be released from both sides from a humanitarian standpoint. That's good. What we haven't seen yet is moves towards peace. It's our understanding that the Russians are going to write up terms for what they would require in order to reach a ceasefire that then would allow broader negotiations. We await those terms, and then we'll have a much better understanding about Mr. Putin's calculation once we see what those terms look like.
So to quote you, the jury's still out.
these are complex conflicts, obviously, that are difficult to bring to bear, and there are a lot of other things playing at stake. But I do think that whatever offer Russia puts on the table, if in fact they do, as they said they were going to do, they put an offer on the table and say, if this happens, we agree to a ceasefire and further negotiations. I think that offer will tell us a lot about their intent here in the short term.
Well, I applaud your and President Trump's efforts to try to bring a ceasefire and hopefully a peaceful outcome to this terrible bloodshed, which has devastated both sides, the Ukrainians and the Russian people. Since you wear multiple hats, including as the archivist and Secretary of State, one of those that you wear is as National Security Advisor, and I want to talk a little bit about the Indo-Pacific and the threat that we face from a potential conflict there. I am delighted to hear President Trump repeatedly say he believes in peace through strength. And I think that is exactly right. I think that's exactly the right approach. But I worry that the United States and our allies are not ready for what could be a conflict initiated by President Xi as early as 2027, when he's instructed the People's Liberation Army to be ready to take Taiwan. General Douglas MacArthur said these words which sort of haunt me in this connection. He said, the history of failure in war is almost always to be summed up in two words: too late. Too late in comprehending the deadly purpose of a potential enemy, too late in realizing the mortal danger, too late in preparedness, too late in uniting all possible forces for resistance. I don't believe we are ready at this point, but can you share with us your view and the administration's view of what we need to do in order to establish that deterrence that comes from peace through strength in the Indo-Pacific?
Yeah, in the most simplistic terms, we have to make the benefit of a Taiwan event for China, we have to make the benefit of it less than the cost. In essence, it has to cost more than what it's worth in order to do something like that. And deterrence is the key to that regard. And I think deterrence obviously begins with Taiwan's own self-defense capabilities. And the harder they are to take militarily, the more time I think they buy for themselves in that regard. I think it continues by having a credible regional deterrent, not just the United States, but Japan and other allied countries around the world, and an increased interest in the Indo-Pacific, by the way, from our European allies. I was at the NATO Foreign Ministers gathering over the last week in Turkey, and multiple member states raised their concerns about the Indo-Pacific and what it would mean for the European continent if there were a conflict there. So I think that also underpins why it's important. We have to understand that anytime there's a conflict in the Middle East or a conflict in Europe or what have you, that we have to dedicate resources and time to that. That's time and resources that we're not dedicating to the Indo-Pacific. We would like to be able to do all things everywhere, but the fact of the matter is there are finite resources and there's only 24 hours in every day. And so it would be of great benefit if we were able to conclude the war in Ukraine and with Russia and Ukraine, if we were able to establish some stability and peace in the Middle East. If we were able to deal with these issues, it would allow us to focus more time, energy, and frankly, resources on some of the challenges we face in the long term with regard to the Indo-Pacific and other parts of the world, but particularly the Indo-Pacific.